Hello, everybody. Welcome to Emergent Bioethics. The goal here is going to be to give a real brief overview of what constitutes as technology, tie that into society, how those two are um, connected, and then just to give an example of how, I guess, an overarching theme for this first slide would be how anything is possible once it becomes available, can eventually, or probably will likely eventually, then become customary. And then what's customary becomes obligatory. So that forms a duty. So possible to available, available to customary, customary to obligatory. Um, we'll leave it there for this slide. Anyway, so technology, know that it has a lot, it's a wider understanding of ideas and items in the world that surpasses just technologies like phones, Apple Watches, and such like that. Anything that is in nature that is either manipulated, put together, or even if it's something is found in nature, like a rock, and then you use the rock for something, then that as a tool then is a technological use. So anything within nature that gets manipulated for the human person or community falls underneath this, and that would include anything from indoor plumbing to the wheel, you name it. Richard Niebuhr, and I'm going to talk about him and C.S. Lewis. Niebuhr talked about this idea of nature always accentuating problems of justice. So this is an easy thing to accept. We can find, say, wider divides between people who have access to something, or people will use technology. Those that have power, the means, the money, and such, they will have access to it and be able to use it to their advantage, and those that don't, obviously cannot. C.S. Lewis, his concern was is that as individuals, specific individuals, have power over nature, they're always going to use that power that they get from this manipulation of nature over other people. So, in other words, he says it quite eloquently: power over nature is really power exercised by some over others using nature. Now, Niebuhr was very famous for talking about the distinction between individuals who may be moral, but when they form groups tend to be immoral. So I bring that up now because we're going to have to at least keep in the back of our minds that even if individuals themselves might be opposed to X, Y, and Z that are not good uses of technology in the world, as a group, we tend to not be as critical. We'll leave it at that. C.S. Lewis thought that the community, um, if they start to look at the human person in terms of utility, will always see the death of some members as useful. Now, that's not as crass as it sounds. He's trying to give the distinction between once the human person is reduced down to utility, then we're going to see them in terms of their usefulness. And quite frankly, some people will be more useful than others. Now, a good illustration of this comes from Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. Just to fill this background real quick, you came off of the 1800s with Thomas Malthus, and we have this concern for overpopulation. You have the introduction of the birth control movement, and this is all coupled with the rise of eugenics, which we already kind of mentioned a little bit in class. So I actually, rather than simply just leave that little blurb on the screen, I took a screenshot of the birth control review from 1921, and this is available online. You can go and find these PDFs. It's a three-column newspaper. I'm just showing it here, condensing the points that I want to illustrate. So, birth control, its use, create a race of thoroughbreds. So, Dave, you're talking about the immigration movement of Jews and Italians in the early part of the 20th century, this melting pot, and also from the Irish from the last part of the previous century, that the distinction between the superior and inferior relational stock. So it's immutable, can't change. So eugenics, though it's still a young field for research, it has good speculative possibilities, say they. In other words, the propagandists are pleading that families of better stock must procreate to save the race from deterioration. So the birth control was intended for those who were not as good stock, and that comes from the utility of the lack of utility that they have. Now, Richard Dawkins, a so-called new atheist, for lack of a better term, how it's known. He talks about people don't deplore eugenics because people deplore eugenics doesn't mean it wouldn't work, right? This is how we breed dogs. So he says, facts just ignore ideology. So is it a junk science? Well, there were some applications of it. There were certainly that, but controlled breeding is not itself junk science. Okay. So If we go back to Aristotle and look at the terms that they would use, techne and societas, uh, techne is one of these, as opposed to episteme, which epistemology, the study of knowledge, that's a theoretical knowledge. Techne is much more practical. Now, it's not self-directing, right? So I guess we could make a distinction, and I probably do in the text, between development and simply progress. Progress is just like the next thing. Development has that sense of manipulation with intention, right? So we would prefer development over simply progress. And societas, this is about the ordering of people that we have to cooperate as a society. I mean, so this is what constitutes society. So the argument here is quite simple and probably easy to digest that you cannot separate technology from society. So if technology is not self-directing, then it has to be regulated. And we would say it has to be regulated by the virtues that are interior to the individual. Society, on the other hand, it can't be isolated from the goals. So if it's not just progress, we're doing the next thing, now we're able to do this, well, what else can we do from that? It's more of a development. So here's what we'd like to do in the end. How do we reach that goal? So you can see that these two things are always connected, inseparable. But if one is not regulated by virtues and the other one, if it doesn't have clear goals that are accepted by society based on those virtues, then we're going to fall back into what Lewis and Niebuhr both said about the individual being reduced to utility and the groups being more immoral than individuals. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this that when something becomes available, it well, something's possible, it becomes available. When something's available, it becomes customary. Once it's customary, it's obligatory. Now, this is not a criticism of, how do you want to say, IVF, but I'm trying to make the point that what was novel for one generation becomes customary for the next. And then when that generation receives it customary, they almost start to think it's obligatory. So let me try to make the point. If we had the first IVF, so-called test tube baby in 1978, and they were extracting the ovum from the natural cycles and such, only within a couple decades, they were giving, stimulating. So there was multiple ovulation, and they can extract more, and then within um, the petri dish to have not one embryo that implants, but multiple embryos. So then we start to see multiple gestations and such, and you start also to see the rise of genetic testing. So that, I guess, that's the thing you can keep in the back of your head about utility, is that once a person has the ability to test the embryo for X, Y, or Z, they will. So once it became available, as it became possible, it's almost going to be obligatory. And by that I mean is somebody may be pressed to say, why would you not test for this? And then if you're testing and accepting something that perhaps is what we would pejoratively phrase a deformer baby, then don't you have an obligation or a duty to not do that? That's sort of the idea. So by 2016, we're already into mitochondrial DNA, so which is particularly useful for, say, lesbian parents, so that they can so that both females can have some genetic link to the offspring. 2030s, probably likely we'll have the artificial womb going by then, but it'll be for premature babies. So it'll be a way to take somebody at 18, 19 weeks gestation and continue them through development outside of the womb, so an exo-womb. Whether or not it's ever possible from fertilization, who knows? There's not there right now. There's just basic speculation that it may not even be possible, but they also speculate that somebody's going to try. So the idea is that as the momentum of screening picks up and we start to be able to identify more things that society, as they manipulate nature, have determined that they are good or bad for society, probably based on, Lewis would say, utility, then we're going to have to wonder, does that desire to be able to use this technology become a duty to use it in the way that society as a whole, and going back to Niebuhr, groups are more immoral than individuals, will this degrade our youth? Who knows? Optimism? Well, we already know the dangers of eugenic movement back in the 20s through the 40s. So will we not do that again? Well, it's hard to say. We may not be so crass about it, but they didn't think they were crass at the time. So the way that we are trying to weed out certain disorders and such could seem very benign from our point of view, and it's hard to interpret 40, 50 years from now how this will be seen. So anyway, no value neutrality. It's just like an ethic. Everything has to be intentional. So, and then whatever we do will basically become means for the next generation to assess how they then will press on. I'll leave it there. So Lewis's caution is, and I'm pretty certain this comes from the abolition of man. He says the final stage of human nature is going to come when human nature itself is the very part of nature to surrender to man. In other words, when we start manipulating that thing which we call the human person, that is like we've already sort of tried to determine how can we use those things in nature to manipulate them. That's technology for the sake of the human person and community. At what point will we then surrender our own nature to this very same metric? Interesting. Okay, so that does the first slide. Now the second one, I just try to walk through quick for you, so you have a basic overview for it. All right. Now, getting a new species, that's, sort of like tongue in cheek, but we're going to talk about the human person and exactly how it may have changed slightly over time, and who knows where it'll be in the future. So, environmental pressures. I just want to say something real briefly about this. If you go back and look at, say, the average weights of individuals who signed up for World War II, my father, you had adult males that were roughly 125, 130 pounds. When I was in high school in the early 80s, I might have mentioned in class, heavyweight wrestling was 185 pounds and over, but 225 was the absolute upper limit. After that, you could not wrestle. Well, today, for various reasons, you now see that those have their own weight classes. There's some, it's maybe negligible and maybe arguable, but there's some concern about puberty being earlier onset and such. Well, that would all be from environmental pressures, whether it's hormones, you name it, whatever is in the food, in the diet, and available to us. The other way that we can do this is through germline engineering. Of course, there's very large ethical issues with this, but that being said, somebody always tries something. Now, as far as brain-machine interfacing and such, you know, think of the implants that could actually help control limbs and think in terms of how this might actually work with individuals that have strokes or have ALS and such. But as we all know, that we usually stretch things. So if we are able to do that, at what point might we, perhaps connect that with germline editing, where they have engineered, say, more astute desirable traits. In other words, they've already been able to increase muscle mass in mice and such, right? That becomes then an heritable trait. So who knows exactly if we have these brain signals, wind up being muscular commands, where that might go. Would it be used in reproduction? It's hard to say. Right now, I'm just trying to put some questions out there. When I talk about essentialism, remember that's the nature of the thing. So, like, if we were to say that a chair is a chair and you can't call a chair something else, in the book I talk in terms of natural kinds and social kinds, right? So, lithium and lead are essential things. They're found in nature. We may have given them their names, but we could not call lithium and lead both the same thing because they don't share the same essential qualities. Well, my question would be, is that true for persons, the human person particularly? Because if you don't at least accept some essential aspect of the human person, then you will reduce them. Call it a reductionist concept of the human person. Like, are we just the combination or the accumulation of our neural networks? Like, is the brain the mind, or is the brain the organ of the mind? And then how do we understand free will and consciousness? So it never gets past our views of philosophical and or theological anthropology. In other words, the view of the human person. Is it a natural kind or is it a social kind? Okay, so then if we have the ability to manipulate nature, specifically through genetic therapy, will we fall to the concerns of Lewis and only, say, be reduction down to how good of a use is this? So So we can use it to prevent or treat a disease. And it's typically invoked when we have something that's very difficult to overcome or it's simply incurable. So you can replace a muted gene. In other words, you can correct a disorder, like a restoration of function. You could perhaps say with cystic fibrosis, remove the genetic marker for a person who's a carrier. Like with disorder, you know, what if they were able to correct a chromosomal deficiency of an adult with Down syndrome? Would that quote unquote fix them? Would we not see that if it was available as something that becomes obligatory, right? So I'm not trying to tell you how to accept this or what to accept, but I am trying to say that these are the questions that will come up. Or what about a predisposition? We might say, okay, well, if I have a predisposition to carpal tunnel syndrome, which they can find, maybe I would accept that. But something else, maybe not so much. Anyway, with the genes, they can either inactivate them or introduce new ones. Newborn screening, um, whether or not it's mandatory and such, because there has been some false positives in the back, and it's pretty standard. But if we were in the class, we could talk more about it. But I'll leave it there for now. Now, as far as this, we've already spoken about this when we talked about IVF earlier in the course. But either pre-genetic testing or pre-genetic diagnosis, we would have to first determine what is undesirable if we're going to test for it, and then select it out prior to implantation. What falls underneath the undesirable, or maybe we can do it in the positive, what is normal, right? And we'd also have to ask whether or not the female has reproductive liberty. Like if they did want to bring somebody, again, I use this scenario if they're trying to sex select their embryos and they have 3 embryos, 2 are female, one's male, and they want to even out their family by bringing a male to live birth, that particular male has the cystic fibrosis predisposition, the marker, the pejorative term, the former baby, would they have the right to do so? Now, the other thing too is whether or not some of these particular, whatever it was that was tested or screened for, are they treatable and manageable? Like, say, there were some indication that the fetus had I'm trying to think of the example I used in class. Let's just say that they had cleft palate. Obviously, quite treatable. Or if it was even, some sort of function, cardiovascular function, you know, would a few surgeries at least bring that individual, back into what we have the so-called normality and such. Now the problem is there's unintentional side effects. So because no gene just does one thing, it can literally have thousands of expressions. We don't know exactly what that would do down the line. We also don't know if entered the germline, where you have a heritable change, what would that mean in 2 or 3 generations? So if we took genetic therapy and we moved beyond treatment, what if we were doing this for improvement? What if we could get more muscle mass? What if we could increase cognition or even memory and such? Again, if it's possible, or if it becomes available, it's going to be tried, and then once it's possible and available, it's going to become customary and does become obligatory. If somebody gave you the option that this individual, that is embryo, would increase cognition and learning, would you not feel that you had the duty to carry that out? Consequences for the culture in the future, well, they inherit society, that cooperative element, just like we did. And what seems normal for us was new to the one before us, but what is new for us will be, normal for them. So how will it affect them, and what will be their views of it? Mosaic embryo, already mentioned that. Could be that the biopsy is out of part of the embryo that does or does not have the undesirable trait. And let's say that you did do this. Do you? This would be an interesting little thought project. Let's say that they did uh, do genetic manipulation with that HIV resistant gene, like Dr. Lee did in China, that those people in Germany also knew could affect or increase cognition and memory. You tell the child as they grow up that we've done this for you. You imagine the expectations for that. It's almost like having older siblings that all we're geniuses and you're already being expected to follow in suit. Interesting point. Okay, transhumanism, so this is a very general term, right? Um, what happens if we get beyond our own present physical and mental limitations using technology, right? So this is why philosophical and theological anthropology are so important. If we're going to say transhumanism, then the idea of trans is from the Latin. It's like this beyond, it's like moving through. So if you're going to say I'm trans-X, you have to be able to identify X before you can say you're trans-X. So if we're going to say there's a possibility or potential for transhumanism, we better have a pretty solid idea of what criteria, let's say, brackets our idea of human. As far as a species, we can leave it at that. So here too, we're talking about treatment and/or enhancement. So a little bit back to this alteration, getting a new species, which sort of like tongue in cheek again, right? We're not making a jump from Neanderthal to Homo sapien. As the human person ceases to develop, or simply we're moving on. So we make a distinction between lifespan and life expectancy. If the life expectancy is in the 70s and the 80s, the lifespan of a human is 120. So my point is even in the best scenario, there's still an upper limit, or is there? Could we, alter that? You often hear people say, 50 is the new 30. But you go on, you can, play around with those decades to say what is the new this. But could it be that what we're calling old age now, 80s and 90s, it becomes much more customary for people to make it into their 110s and 120s, not just these individuals that get the news every so many years. But would that still be the border? And this isn't trying to make an overarching, criticism of this, but it does beg the question that if we are trying to do some sort of enhancement by manipulation of technology, what is our view of this perfect human? Is there a utopian human? Nonetheless, CRISPR, that's the genetic scissors that's used for this. Posthumanism would just be, the advent of whatever this is that gets beyond that. We'll leave it there. I didn't want to make too much of it, simply something to put up there. Again, if we were in class, we could have had some discussions about that. But if we're trying to achieve justice, right? So remember, I talked about subsidiarity being at least what I thought as a better approach to justice than trying to delve through equity and equality, because it would allow people at the bottom level, right? So we're back to the moral individual rather than the immoral society, how Niebuhr puts it. But if people have unfettered power, they're going to use it as a means to an end, which is why I think C.S. Lewis foresaw back in the 30s that just that view of utility would be the thing that engages people once they're trying to conquer not just nature, but human nature. Who has access to this? We always have to say, does this serve the person? Or, if you use Kant's categorical imperative, you cannot use one person as you can't use somebody as a means to an end. Well, then we have to say this would be going against that categorical imperative, right? So I'll leave it with this. C.S. Lewis says the power of man to make himself what he pleases, like if we think we can manipulate our nature and become what we think we should be, Lewis says it's not going to end like that. It's only going to end where the power of some people will make other people like they please. So going back to Margaret Sanger and that comment in Planned Parenthood about the propagandists pleading families had better stock procreate to save the race from deterioration. Okay, maybe we're not going to be so crass about that, but maybe we're going to think that genetically we can do something. And it could be that 100 years from now, that particular future society is aghast with the things that we have tried. Anyway, that was a quick run through. I hope it's helpful for you guys. See you back in the classroom soon.